Hello, welcome in this short video about unpacking decolonization. I'm Riyad Gamour. I'm a doctoral researcher in education affiliated to the Graduate School of Education, University of Exeter. As I said, the title of this short video is Unpacking Decolonization. So we will see what does this mean, what does it look like, and why do we need to decolonize? So basically looking at the rationale behind decolonization. It is important to stress on the fact that this is only an introduction to some of the key ideas. So your private learning and the process of reflexivity are needed to sustain understanding and praxis within your respective research projects and disciplines. It is important to recognize that decolonization is an ongoing process of self-examination, reflexivity, and responsibility. And I do encourage you to unpack some of the information further as part of your private learning after you watch this video. So the aim of this introductory course is to develop an understanding of decolonization, reflect on why decolonizing, and understand the key principles to start doing the work, basically. It is important to recognize that the information and knowledge which I will be outlining are constantly changing, and nothing is fixed and static. But it is our responsibility to keep cultivating this understanding and praxis as we journey in this process of decolonization. These are some questions which I invite you to take away as part of your private learning and process of reflexivity. So the first question is, what do I believe about the ultimate purpose of decolonization? How do I routinely reflect upon my positionality, biases, assumptions, and attitudes which may knowingly or unknowingly have implications on my research, curriculum, teaching, and so on? What hinders me to decolonize? And who should decolonize? So let's start with why decolonizing. It is important to remember that before any attempt to engage with decolonization, we need to understand and reflect on the why. Why do we need to decolonize? This indeed can provide solid ground to pursue the work with care and reflection. Jumping on the decolonial bandwagon without having a critical understanding of the past, present, and future may run the risk of causing more harm than good. So we don't want to be tokenistic or performative in our decolonial actions. So the answer which we are providing in here is derived from my lived experience, but also conversations which I have been having with peers, colleagues and activists, but also scholarship and our respective research. I say our because I've been working with different groups within the University of Exeter, but also beyond, as an example, the Exeter Decolonizing Network. So as you can see, the first point is based on decentering Euro-America in theory and praxis. And here it refers to how the world has always been looked at from a Euro-American lens as a default of knowing and being at the expense of other ways of knowing and being. The second rationale is to undo direct colonization. As an example, the occupation of Palestine, and coloniality, which refers to colonial legacies and attitudes which are still perpetuated in education, power structures, and social orders. The third rationale concerns the rewriting and the rewriting. So Indigenous Maori scholar and activist Linda Tuhiwai Smith speaks about how, for example, Indigenous history has been written by previous colonizers and Western explorers and researchers, as well as how the indigenousness has been othered and excluded from various accounts in the academy. So she calls for a process of decolonization through a process of rewriting and rewriting Indigenous position in history. Indigenous people, including minoritized communities that have been historically oppressed, want to tell their own stories, write their own versions in their own ways for their own purposes. The next rationale is addressing epistemic violence. The academy has always been in favor of Western knowledge as being more superior than any other knowledge. Consequently, this has created inequality, violence, and colonization of the mind, assuming that Western knowledge is deemed to be valid, true, impartial, and universal. Decolonization problematizes such taken for granted assumptions and narratives and asks the following questions. Whose knowledge matters? Which knowledge is deemed legitimate? Who decides? Who produces it? For whose benefit? And who has access to this knowledge? And last but not least, decolonization is a moral responsibility to expose, name, and frame oppressive systems and bring about social justice approaches to education and beyond. So what is decolonization? And I have here a definition that is not absolute, so it is always open to change. Decolonization is a long-term process involving the bureaucratic, cultural, linguistic, and psychological divesting of colonial power by undoing the privileging of dominant Euro-centered cultural values and beliefs in education, scholarship, knowledge production, the legitimization of intellectual capital, and the networks and systems of power. It is about redefining where power is located. This shift will include allowing the colonized to view and understand themselves through their own worlds. So what I'm reading from this quote is that decolonization is a process of unpacking matters of power, which is embedded in the normative values, narratives, attitudes, and knowledge production. And this normativity is usually grounded in Euro-America, as stated in the rationale. Decolonization is also dismantling hierarchies. For example, Western knowledge is more superior than any other knowledge. It is about redistributing power to communities and groups which have been historically oppressed, silenced, and marginalized to reach emancipation and empowerment. And again, the process of decolonization is unique, depending on the context and other social and geopolitical aspects. So what does it mean to Exeter? Last year and this year, I'm involved in different research projects grounded in decolonization, and I am involved in this project about decolonizing the curriculum. So we distributed cross-campus surveys to both staff and students in order to collect their views about what does decolonization mean to Exeter, obviously. So the responses we got were very diverse, but also we tried to come up with this definition of what it is in our context. So decolonization refers to the critical awareness and the undoing of colonial legacies that are perpetuated in the present world, reproducing inequalities, injustice, and racism. This can be manifested in the curriculum, power structures, and internalized narratives which maintain white supremacy and whiteness as an ideology to see the world. But also it is important to acknowledge intersectionality when we speak about decolonization. And I mean here articulation of race with gender, sexuality, class, so on and so forth. Now we have had a brief look at decolonization at the abstract level. The question which is asked now is, what does it look like? It is important to recognize that decolonizing doesn't have a formula. It all depends on the context, as I said, shaped by history, politics, and global events. For example, in the UK context, during and after the rise of the Black Lives Matter movement, there have been more initiatives to decolonize the curriculum, for example, and decolonizing the university and education. As an example, we had this movement, Why is my curriculum white? That took place in UCL quite a few years ago. So here are some of the principles to embrace as part of the process of decolonization, because it is important to recognize that decolonization starts from within. The first one is decolonizing the mind. The first step of decolonization starts with ourselves and our minds. We have internalized so many narratives as being universal truth. But what is truth? Who embodies truth? Who decides? And who has access to it? It is important to embark upon this process of reflexivity and self-examination to unpack our taken for granted narratives and assumptions, and being critical towards knowledge, the values and the principles which shape our existence, discipline, research, and so on. The second point, which overlaps with the first one, is about knowledge and power. It is important to question the knowledge we read or teach, because knowledge is loaded with power. And again, it is important to question whose knowledge matters, which knowledge is deemed legitimate, who decides, who produces it, for whose benefit, and who has access to it. The third principle is looking at whiteness as an ideology. It is important again to remember that we are not talking about white individuals here, but about whiteness as a construct, as an ideology. Decolonization endeavors to decenter white knowledge, values, and norms as the sole base of looking, understanding, and shaping our world and history. And the last point is about commitment to social justice. Decolonization is a commitment to bring about social justice-based approaches to inequality, inequity, and structural violence, which privilege certain groups and oppress others. Decolonization is systemic. And these are some of the questions I have asked at the beginning of this session, and I invite you to reflect upon them as part of your private learning. And thank you so much for watching.